Well, good afternoon, good morning, perhaps good evening for some of you. Welcome to this special live event, a behind the scenes look at MCC's work. Greetings to all of you. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. You're here in part because you responded to the current hunger crisis in the world. So we want to thank you for responding, for your ongoing support of MCC, and for your interest in our work. We are thrilled that you are a part of the MCC story and that we can offer you this unique view of the ways that we are working together, serving in the name of Christ. My name is Scott Campbell. I serve as the Director of Development for MCC Canada, and today I'll be your host and moderator. I'm calling in from my home in Fort Langley, British Columbia, just outside of Vancouver. And before we get started, let me just walk us through a few logistics for the day, or for this half hour that we're together. We're presenting via Zoom, and participants will be kept muted throughout this live event. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A function, which you can find on the black bar at the bottom of your screen when you move your mouse. Our questions will be moderated, and it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get to them all, but we are going to try and get to as many of them as possible. We do thank you for submitting your questions in advance as well. We've received a number of questions from a number of you who are attending, and we will work to get to those as well. We are recording this session, and the recording of this event will be made public following the live presentation. So if there's someone that you know would like to catch up on what we've been able to share here, you'll be able to share that with them. Or if you'd like to go back and listen again to some of the answers that we will provide today, you can go back and take a look. So let's begin. Between June 24th and July 17th, MCC supporters like you gave more than $1.2 million in response to the current and ongoing global hunger crisis. And that's just incredible. It gives us so much hope for the work moving forward. In this Q&A, Bruce Guenther is going to give us an update on what he's hearing from MCC partners around the world. He's going to share with us how gifts like yours have already made a huge difference. Bruce will present, and then, as I said, we'll use the rest of our 30 minutes for questions and conversation. So let me introduce my colleague, Bruce Guenther. Bruce is the Disaster Response Director for MCC. He has overall responsibilities for MCC's humanitarian food security program globally, including MCC's relationship and funding with the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. Bruce has had the honor of serving for over 15 years with MCC. He lives in Winnipeg with his partner Emily and their daughter Sophia. So Bruce, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And yeah, thanks again for everybody for joining. We're going to throw up a few slides here to get started. And I just want to start by echoing what Scott said, which is a huge, huge thank you to everybody who contributed to this hunger crisis appeal, and just also your ongoing support, because yes, there's been a specific appeal for this hunger crisis, but this need is ongoing, and in many places these are chronic crises, so we need that ongoing support. So thank you. Okay, so I'm going to do a few kind of questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So firstly, we want to talk about what are the causes of the crisis. So as you will all see from your grocery bill when you go to the gas station, the impact of COVID now, as we come out of COVID, or we're in the midst of the pandemic, or wherever you say we are, that's had huge impacts on inflation, both on commodity prices, which both includes food and fuel. And food prices are very much linked to the cost of fuel because of inputs that are required and transport, obviously. Many of the countries that are facing this crisis have ongoing conflict and ongoing displacement. So that inflationary impact is just on top of already a very dire situation and humanitarian crises in those situations. And then in some cases, like in South Sudan, which was the feature of our appeal, there's also been flooding. So people are displaced or are returning, and then there's flooding in the area where we are responding. In other cases, in like the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, there's drought that's not been seen in over 40 years. And then even in Zimbabwe, again, very significant drought this year. And that's all in line with that those droughts in both the Horn of Africa and in Southern Africa are very much in line with predictions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they are becoming more frequent and they are becoming more severe as a result of a changing climate. And then, of course, on top of the inflationary impacts from COVID, then obviously the current crisis in Ukraine then further hampers the supply of food, which then further just drives up that price. So it's a confluence of all these factors that's leading to this crisis. So who is most impacted? So 49 million people in 44 countries are at risk of acute hunger. That means they're on the edge of famine. Famine is a technical definition in terms of mortality and in terms of malnutrition. But yeah, there are many people at risk of kind of on the brink of that very catastrophic level of hunger. And that 49 million is up, from 27 million in 2019. So it's quite a dramatic increase. And that's on top of the global population, of which 10% are chronically food insecure. So those families that are already food insecure are obviously the ones that are then further impacted and further facing this crisis. And that's primarily due to conflict and, as I said, other hazards or disasters that they face, such as flooding, drought, or in one case this year in Burundi, where they had a very significant hailstorm. And then in the picture here, you'll see Nirawat. She is one of the beneficiaries of our programming in South Sudan in Rakona County. She's returned she was a refugee in Sudan. She fled South Sudan, now has returned. And she's 28 years old, has 5 children, and is widowed. And she benefits from the food assistance that MCC provides on a monthly basis. Prior to that, she was collecting firewood in order to make a living, and then also tries to sell water and juice on the side to supplement the food that she gets. She stays with family family that are hosting her and are also trying to support her and her children. And when asked about what does she have to say about the food she's responding, she just says, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, and God bless you. I would not be able to feed my children if it weren't for that support." So as a father, as a parent, you can imagine the struggle that one would have not being able to feed your children every day and wondering where that next meal is coming. So in addition to, obviously, people are more hungry because of the food crisis and the inflation on food, but then it also is for the ongoing responses we have, like in South Sudan, like in Syria or Lebanon, it's also costing us more because of that inflation on food prices. So in the case of South Sudan, for example, we were just doing the procurement on the food for this next phase, and the price of sorghum, which is staple food, the price has gone up 48%. So we are already spending that money that you have given us, and unfortunately, that's just being eaten up by the inflationary pressure on that food towards our ongoing program, while we also try to scale up to meet more need. Okay, and then what is our response? I've gone into that a little bit. Trying to scaling up our food assistance responses. So like in South Sudan, trying to add more families as resources are available. Responding to the drought situation in Kenya and Zimbabwe, as well as conflict in Ethiopia, particularly Tigray region. And then in addition to that, we have very significant food assistance responses in Syria and Lebanon. And we're trying to maintain that same level of support despite the massive increase in prices and the deteriorating economic situation in both Lebanon and in Syria. So there's the emergency part of that. There's the food assistance that we provide to people, but then there's also at the same time long-term solutions that we're working on. That includes trying to promote more techniques, agricultural techniques that are more drought resistant. So that's our conservation ag program, which is throughout Africa. And as well in places like Syria, trying to help support people with grants to start small businesses so that they can, increase their potential for a more sustainable livelihood going forward. Okay, Scott, that's my quick summary. We can go to questions.
Yeah, Bruce, thanks so much. I have a few questions for you first, just based on things that we know we hear from donors quite regularly. I mentioned in your introduction that you also work with the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. So who else is MCC, or maybe I should say it this way, who else is responding to this food crisis, this hunger crisis, and how is MCC partnering with them?
Yeah, great question, Scott. So we are members of Canadian Foodgrains Bank, along with 14 other church members in Canada. And all of us are trying to scale up our response. And the beauty of working with CFGB is that by pooling our resources together and by collaborating together, we're able to do more and meet more needs. So we have different members of CFGB that share resources between ourselves. So maybe if we don't have a response in Somalia, for example, we're able to support other agencies that do. And then others do the same in turn for places like Syria, where we have unique programming. So all those members of Foodgrains Bank are responding, as well as many other agencies across Canada that participated with the Humanitarian Coalition.
Great, thanks, Bruce. We often hear questions about impact, and so what change do we want to see? What are we working towards?
Yeah, so in a humanitarian situation like this, what we're trying to prevent is, people undertaking what we call like negative coping strategies. So people further selling assets like they have, like livestock, which they need to support their living, or people that are skipping meals, or certain members of the household that are not fed or prioritized or deprioritized over other people in the household, like girls or women in the household. So we're trying to prevent those negative things that people are forced to do because they're hungry. And then at the same time, we're trying to meet that standard, the minimum standard that people need in terms of the calories that they need to consume per day. So when we're assessing any kind of food response, what we're trying to do is to make sure that people meet that minimum, that they have enough food to feed their family, and that they're getting the necessary calories they need per day. One of the challenges is when there's so much need, people often will share the ration that they receive. So it actually, though intended to support them for the full month, that's how we calculate that. People are often, you folks have all been very generous with your resources, and even people just in the most need as well are also generous with their neighbors and people around them that are also in a similar situation.
Yeah. Complicated, hey? Complicated. You mentioned Syria, and MCC's been responding to the crisis in Syria for a decade now. We, in our appeal, highlighted South Sudan, but can you say a little bit about how this hunger crisis is impacting the work in Syria?
Yeah, so unfortunately in Syria, they are also, like the people are, there are 70% of the population that's in need of humanitarian assistance, which is very significant. And the largest food assistance or emergency programming that we have is in Syria. And so on top of like the inflationary pressure from the global food crisis, they're also facing economic crisis as they recover from years of conflict. So I use the example of the sorghum in South Sudan. When we look at the food basket in Syria this year over last year, it's increased 38%. And that's a 6-digit number in terms of what that costs us, in addition to what we're already doing. So we're facing the crunch in terms of the resources that are needed to just maintain this level of support for people that we have over the last 10 years. And unfortunately, that need continues. Yeah, and we are thankful and will need ongoing resources to meet that need.
Many of the folks who are on this call responded because they are longtime supporters of MCC. Many of them will have responded because there was a match in place through the Canadian government. Can you say a little bit about how those matching dollars and how much of that matching dollars MCC received?
Yeah, so as you said, Scott, we raised 1.2 million, of which 1.1 million of that was eligible for the match. I believe that relates to it being because it needs to be from a private or an individual donor. So which is amazing. That's like I think when we were talking originally, we were hoping that we'd get, somewhere around 300,000. So just a huge thanks to everybody. So with that 1.1, that's been matched by the Canadian government. And in total, the whole Foodgrains Bank network raised 2.3. So, and then Canadian Foodgrains Bank, who's then part of the Humanitarian Coalition, which gets the match, in total, they raised 5.6. So we raised almost a fifth of the entire match that the government is giving to the Humanitarian Coalition. So when that money comes from Global Affairs Canada or the Government of Canada, it goes to the Humanitarian Coalition, which then goes to Canadian Foodgrains Bank, which is how we are currently members of that matching appeal. And so through working with Foodgrains Bank, that matching amount is then programmed through MCC and the other members of Canadian Foodgrains Bank in terms of the allocation that we get from the Humanitarian Coalition.
That's great. And you mentioned that on the onset, we were hoping that we could maybe raise 300,000. And so it just, as I said at the top of our time together, it's just been such an encouragement to be able to see the generosity and faithfulness of our supporters in response to this particular appeal.
Well, and I think too, Scott, like people, it seems that that appeal related to hunger and those basic human needs really strikes a chord with our supporters, and that's not new. But we're extremely thankful and humbled and proud.
Yeah, all those things. It's very true. We have about 12 minutes left in our time together. I'm going to transition to questions from our supporters. I'm going to start with the questions that we received from some folks who did register for our time together. I also invite people who are listening, our participants now, if you want to enter your question into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen, feel free to do so. We aren't going to be able to get to all the questions today, but it is being moderated and we will try to get to as many as we can. So in our registration form, Adrian asked the following question, Bruce. How do you choose priorities for hunger relief?
Yeah, so I would say there's kind of three different things. So obviously, one is what resources are we working with? Number two would be based on need. So where, there's, as I said, 44 countries that face this acute crisis. And then the third criteria would be capacity. So it's where that need and capacity line up, where we're able to respond. So when I say capacity, I mean, do we have a country office or country program in the country? Do we have partners that have experience and are able to deliver that program? And thankfully, in many of these cases, thankfully and unfortunately, we do have many partners that are very strong in responding to humanitarian crises, and MCC has provided significant support to those partners through over many years. So it's that balance of, okay, where is the need most critical? And then do we have partners and staff that are able to ensure that that's done properly?
Yeah, thanks, that's helpful. Christine asks the following: how do you plan to structure things so that the maximum benefits of gifting goes to the actual cause?
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple things there. It relates to that capacity question. So again, or that question on how do we prioritize. So for sure we want to prioritize based on the most need. And then when we review proposals and budgets that come from our country office and our partners, we review that very carefully. That's also reviewed by people at Canadian Foodgrains Bank. When we do the purchase of food locally, that's done through a rigorous procurement process in order to ensure we get both good quality food and also get a good price for the food that we're distributing. And I think part of that question about maximum benefit is also about, okay, how do you decide who receives the assistance, which is always a very difficult thing to do. And that's prioritized based on a number of criteria. So based on the context. So obviously very vulnerable households, like the one we heard about. So if you are a female-headed household, if you have a large number of young children in your household, if you have people that are not able to work because they are disabled, those households would be prioritized. Yeah, and then as part of the follow-up and on the selection of those families, we also make sure we do monitoring and evaluation. So we ensure that includes questions related to people's consumption, whether or not they're getting enough food and enough diversity of food, and just basic questions about, you were supposed to receive X, did you receive X, as a verification thing that we do. And I was saying to a colleague the other day, Scott, that yeah, if we were the standard that we have for international program and through Canadian Foodgrains Bank would far exceed any type of monitoring and evaluation that would be required of someone in Canada if they went to a food bank, for example. So yeah, just to ensure people that there are lots of monitoring processes in place and ensuring and regular review of programming to ensure that we're getting the best results.
Yeah, I know when I started with the organization and saw how you and your colleagues are monitoring and evaluating and looking at metrics and following up with participants, it's a remarkable amount of work to make sure that our donors giving is being used for maximum impact, and learning so much. You learn so much from that process to be able to then respond even more effectively. It's quite a thing. We could spend a lot of time on monitoring and evaluation, but that is not the purpose of today. I'm gonna answer a question because we had a question that I think is similar to the question about how we maximize benefit. And this question comes from another registrant, which says, what percentage of donation goes to administration? And that's a question we often get. We refer to our administrative costs, and you can see this in our annual impact report, as core mission support. We do that because we're very convinced that administrative costs ensure that the infrastructure that allow us to deliver programming is solid and secure, and that we can continue as we have for over 100 years delivering on our program commitments. And so our administrative costs, or our core mission support, by policy and by practice, doesn't exceed 20% in any fiscal year. And you can see more about how we have that broken down in our annual impact report. We've also had that looked at by a third party. Some of you will be familiar with Charity Intelligence. Charity Intelligence is an independent not-for-profit in Canada that does its own monitoring and evaluation of over 800 charities in Canada. And for several years, we've come out with top ratings on our impact and our fiscal responsibility. You'll see that we've just posted a link to our charities page, or our summary page on Charity Intelligence. And for the last several years, we've ranked in Charity Intelligence top 10 impact international charities, international impact charities in Canada. And that's something that we didn't necessarily seek to achieve, but when you're named a top 10 impact charity, it's something worth sharing with people. And so that's something that you can take a look at as well. Bruce, I'm going to go back to some questions that we received for you from our registrants, from our participants. Fern asks this following: what long-term solutions are we funding for a leg up?
Hmm. Yeah, and there's a number of other expressions that could be used if people frame that question. So some people will say, or use the expression, give a person a fish, feed him for a day, um, teach someone to fish, feed them for a lifetime. Problem with things that kind of expression, and that's not what Fern's asking, but it's a segue for me. Is that the problem is that when people don't have the fish for the day, they have to sell their fishing rod. And so that in order for people to get a leg up, they need that safety net, and they can't springboard out of poverty unless they have that safety net to catch them. Because the key driver of chronic poverty is vulnerability to conflict, vulnerability to drought, vulnerability to flooding, or just vulnerability to, people who have a death in the family, that kind of thing. So in short, in order to have that humanitarian assistance goes one and the same with, for example, in Zimbabwe, where they're facing a drought, and at the same time of us providing food assistance, we're also working with them to promote conservation agriculture in those districts, because we want to ensure that there's long-term solution to a drought that is going to be more frequent and more severe as the years go on.
That makes me think of the work that we do that I've come to learn is called that triple nexus, where there's that overlap or that sweet spot between relief work, development work, and peace work. And can you say 30 seconds about what that is and why that's so important to how we go about our work?
Yeah, for sure. And obviously the peace building work in and itself is trying to prevent conflict, which often is the main driver of global hunger, more so than drought or flooding or any of those causes. So that's really important work. That peace building work is very important to ensure long-term food security. And then we try to integrate that piece, that nexus piece or that integration piece. We try to integrate that into our programming so that when you're distributing a huge amount of resources, you need to do so in a careful way. And so by ensuring that we have different representatives from the community that are part of ensuring the selection criteria for people that benefit and ensuring that there's good community ownership for the process, we prevent conflict happening in the community because of the additional resources that are coming to the community.
Yeah, it's I'm sure there's a number of participants who will find that insightful and probably have some more questions. Unfortunately, we're going to quickly run out of time, and so we have time for one more question. And Evelyn's asking this question. She says, is there any hope for an end to the conflict in Ethiopia? How is it affecting the Ethiopian Mennonite Church?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe to turn the question a different way, I would say it's the Ethiopian Church, the Mizrate Christos Church, that gives me hope. They are very keen to work with MCC, both to respond to the conflict in Tigray, to respond to the conflicts in other parts of Ethiopia, and are really trying to balance all these different needs from, their hundreds and hundreds of congregations that they have. And part of that response is also saying we need to be working at peace building, and we need to be doing that, bringing together all the different representatives from churches across the country and different ethnicities together to work on that peace building. And that's a long-term solution, and is going to take time. So that gives me hope. I could talk a lot about the conflict in Ethiopia in terms of what the outcome is there. Unfortunately, yeah, it's one of those chronic conflicts, or has become a chronic conflict. And yeah, the church gives me hope in terms of both its humanitarian response as well as the way that they really want to, reflect our commitment to, the way of peace.
I think that's a good place to end our conversation. We've got 1 minute left, and let me just say thank you to all of the participants who have joined us today. Let me also thank Bruce for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to spend half an hour with us answering these questions. I'm hoping that the participants who have been with us have found this insightful and meaningful, and maybe taking away a couple of new bits of information that they can mull over or share as they think about discussing the hunger crisis with those in their circles of influence. What's next? If you want to know more about the hunger crisis, we recently produced a podcast episode. Our podcast is called Relief Development and Podcasts, and you can find it on any platform where you download your podcasts. And this episode featured Andy Harrington, who is the executive director of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank that Bruce has mentioned a number of times. The episode is titled Hunger Crisis with Andy Harrington, and it's definitely worth a listen. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you found this time informative, and on behalf of Bruce and on MCC as a whole, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for being with us. Bye now.